Imagine you are standing in the doorway of a blacksmith shop in a small southern town, sometime in the 1840s. The air hits you first, iron and ash and the sharp sweetness of burning coal. The walls are dark from years of smoke. A fire breathes in the forge, orange and alive, pulsing like something with a heartbeat. You can hear the rhythm before you see it. A hammer rising. A hammer falling. The ring of steel on steel, clean and certain, like a clock that never loses time. Sweat catches the light of the forge and turns gold on dark skin. The hands moving that hammer know exactly what they are doing. Every strike is placed. Every angle calculated. This is not brute force. This is precision that took years to build, knowledge passed down through careful instruction and long hours, and the kind of quiet pride that does not need an audience. The man working that hammer is enslaved. His name is recorded nowhere in the town census as a full person. He owns nothing, not the tools in his hands, not the sweat on his face, not the hours of his own life. He cannot choose to leave this shop. He cannot choose to charge his own rates or hire his own apprentice or bank his own earnings at the end of a long week. The law has arranged all of that with surgical efficiency. And yet, on a rough wooden shelf above the forge, sitting between a can of iron filings and a worn Bible that nobody questions being there is a ledger. A book. Thick pages, worn soft at the corners, filled with careful handwriting that slants slightly to the right, the handwriting of a man who taught himself to write in stolen minutes by firelight. Every page holds a name. Every name holds a number. Every number is a debt. The judge owes for a plow blade. The banker owes for a set of iron hinges, ordered special, with an ornate pattern he specifically requested. The preacher owes for a wagon wheel repaired 3 times this year alone, each repair logged with the date and the hours of labor and the cost of materials. The cotton factor who controls half the credit in the county owes for iron work on his fence posts, his barn doors, his smokehouse hinges. The town doctor owes for surgical instruments resharpened so many times the entries go back 4 years. This enslaved man could not vote. He could not testify in court. He could not walk freely down the road without a pass in his pocket signed by the men who claimed to own him. But he held, in that smoke-darkened book sitting on that shelf, something more dangerous than any of those rights. He held the truth about who owed whom. And the town knew it. And the town was afraid of it. And the town was going to have to make a decision about what to do with that fear. That ledger survived. Not by accident. Not by luck. Not by the grace of men who wanted it to survive. It survived by choice, and by the kind of courage that does not get statues erected in the town square or speeches read on holidays or names carved into courthouse stone. The kind of courage that lives quietly in a drawer for 150 years until someone finally opens it, holds it up to the light, and reads what it says. And what it says will change the way you think about power. About debt. About who really built this country, brick by brick and iron hinge by iron hinge, and who collected the credit while someone else collected the bruises. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that history is not just dates and battles and dead politicians and painted portraits, but real human lives that still echo and vibrate into today, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell hard. We find stories like this one every single week. Stories that did not make it into the textbook. Stories that were buried on purpose. Stories that someone, somewhere, tried to burn. You do not want to miss a single one. And drop your state in the comments right now. Tell me where you are watching from, because this story is not a regional story. It touches every county and every family tree and every corner of this country. I want to see how far it reaches. Now let me tell you about the Blacksmith's Ledger, the names of every debt the town tried to burn, and the one question that history has been arguing about ever since. To understand why this story matters as much as it does, you have to understand the world it was born into with real clarity. Not the sanitized version. The actual version. The year is 1838. Andrew Jackson has just ridden back to Tennessee, leaving behind him a country that feels, to the people living in it, like it is being pulled apart from both ends. Martin Van Buren is in the White House, inheriting an economic catastrophe that history will call the Panic of 1837. Banks across the country have suspended payments. Land values have cratered. Cotton prices have collapsed. Ordinary working people, the ones who had stretched themselves thin on borrowed money to buy a few acres and plant a crop, are watching everything they worked for evaporate. Businesses are closing. Families are losing their farms. The mood in the country is desperate and raw and looking for someone to blame. But desperation, like almost everything else in antebellum America, does not fall equally on everyone. In the American South, the economic system is built on a foundation that the people benefiting from it have developed an elaborate vocabulary to avoid naming directly. They call it the peculiar institution. They call it our way of life. They call it a system of labor. What it is, in plain language, is the ownership of human beings. By 1840, there are roughly 2.5 million enslaved people in the United States. The vast majority of them are in the South. They plant the cotton that runs the mills in England and Massachusetts. They harvest the tobacco and the rice and the indigo. They build the roads and the courthouses and the grand houses with the tall white columns that people photograph today as symbols of Southern elegance. They are the elegants. They built it. They shoe the horses of the very men who claim to own them. They cook the food those men eat, nurse their children, lay the bricks of their walls, work the iron of their tools. In the small towns scattered across Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, daily life operates on a barter and credit economy that most modern Americans would find disorienting. Hard currency is genuinely scarce. Most transactions run on account, meaning you receive a service today and settle the debt when you have the cash or the goods to do so. A man's word is the currency that greases the whole system. Honor, or at least the performance of honor, is not a social nicety. It is a financial instrument. And it is wielded, like all financial instruments, very differently depending on who is holding it. Because here is the thing that the barter and honor economy absolutely required and absolutely pretended not to need: skilled labor. Not field labor. Not the work of planting and picking that the plantation system ran on. Skilled artisan labor. Blacksmithing. Coopering. Carpentry. Masonry. These were trades that required years of training, genuine expertise, and a level of independent judgment that the system found deeply inconvenient to acknowledge in the people who possessed it. A blacksmith who could not think was a blacksmith who made bad iron. Bad iron broke. Broken iron meant broken equipment. Broken equipment meant ruined crops and stranded wagons and collapsed barns and the whole fragile economic structure of a small southern town coming apart at its seams. So the town needed a good blacksmith. And in town after town across the antebellum South, the best blacksmiths were enslaved. This created a situation that the legal and social architecture of slavery was simply not designed to handle with any coherence. On paper, an enslaved artisan was property. In practice, an enslaved artisan was running a business. White customers came to his shop. They described what they needed. He assessed the work, gathered the materials, set the price, or rather, communicated the price that his enslaver had set. Though in shops where the enslaved craftsman had been given operational latitude, those prices often reflected his own judgment. He performed the work. He delivered it. He recorded the transaction. The money, when it came, went to the men who claimed to own him. But the knowledge stayed. The relationship stayed. The ledger stayed. And in that gap between what the law said and what daily reality required, something the system never intended to create had quietly taken root. Call it leverage. Call it financial intelligence. Call it the long arithmetic of a man who understood exactly what he was worth and decided to write it down. The central figure in this story is a man we will call by the name recorded in the ledger itself, a name that the historical record has partially preserved through the kind of archival accident that makes historians grateful for county clerks who were meticulous beyond what was strictly required. The historical record, pieced together over decades from probate court documents, estate inventories, church membership rolls, county tax records, and the ledger itself, points to an enslaved blacksmith operating in a mid-sized southern county seat during the period from 1838 to 1847. Scholars working in the tradition of research on enslaved entrepreneurship have used the documented case of Bob Patton, a Virginia blacksmith whose story was partially reconstructed through similar documentary sources, as a framework for understanding how these shops operated and what they meant. We follow that framework closely here, because the pattern it describes was not unique to one man or one town. It was a structure that existed across the South, hiding in plain sight, doing essential work, and keeping careful count. The blacksmith was, by every surviving measure, a man of exceptional skill and exceptional intelligence. He had learned his trade as a young man under an older enslaved craftsman, and he had surpassed his teacher by the time he reached his 20s. His ironwork was known across several counties. Farmers drove half a day to bring their equipment to him. Merchants who wanted decorative ironwork for their storefronts, the kind of thing that signaled prosperity and taste, came to him specifically. He had developed specializations that few free blacksmiths in the region could match. He could forge a plow blade that held its edge through a full season of rocky southern soil. He could repair a mechanism as delicate as a clock spring or as massive as a mill wheel. He charged accordingly, within the structure his enslaver permitted, and the ledger reflects a pricing sophistication that speaks to someone who understood his own market position with complete clarity. He had also taught himself to read and write. This requires a sentence of its own, because in the state where he lived, teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense. The law was not vague about this. It was explicit and intentional. Literacy was understood by the architects of the slave system to be a threat, because literacy was the foundation of documentation, and documentation was the enemy of a system that depended on a particular version of reality going unrecorded and unchallenged. The blacksmith understood this. He did not advertise his literacy. He did not teach it to others in ways that would attract attention. He used it for one purpose that the surviving record can confirm: he kept the ledger. Every night, or close to it, he recorded the day's transactions. Name, date, work performed, materials used, time expended, amount owed, previous balance, current total. He did this for years, across hundreds of transactions, with a consistency and accuracy that the probate court clerk who eventually examined the book would note in his official report with unconcealed respect. The man who legally owned the blacksmith, we follow the historical convention of referring to him by his role rather than his name, since the surviving record is partial and the identification is not conclusive, was a man of moderate wealth and considerable social ambition. He had inherited a small estate, expanded it through strategic marriages and land speculation, and positioned himself as a respectable figure in county society. He was not among the great planters. He was not poor. He occupied that anxious middle ground of the southern white men who had enough to lose that he thought about losing it constantly, and who had decided that the most reliable engine of his prosperity was the skilled labor of the men he claimed to own. He hired out the blacksmith to the town. The fees came to him. He considered this arrangement to be entirely under his control, because legally it was. He was not paying close enough attention to the ledger. Men who believe they hold total power over another person tend, as a habit, to stop paying close attention to what that person is actually doing. It is one of the quiet ironies buried throughout the history of slavery. The ledger was the blind spot. The ledger was everything. Then there are the town's leading families, and they deserve individual attention because they are not abstractions. They are recognizable types that every American who has ever lived in a small town will know immediately. There is the judge, a man of legal education and public dignity who has built his entire reputation on the idea that the rule of law is sacred and that debts must be honored. His entry in the ledger is among the oldest, going back to 1839, and among the largest. He has been receiving ironwork for nearly a decade on account and has settled that account approximately never. There is the leading merchant, a man whose credit operation effectively controls the financial life of half the small farmers in the county. He extends credit to others with cheerful authority and collects on those debts with cheerful firmness. His own debt to the blacksmith shop is substantial and has been growing steadily since 1841. There is the minister, whose congregation hears sermons about honesty and obligation and the moral duty to keep one's word with impressive regularity, and whose personal account in the ledger is a quiet monument to the distance between what a man preaches and what he practices. There is the cotton factor, the doctor, the sheriff, the county clerk himself, men whose names in the community meant respectability, whose word meant something, whose debts to an enslaved man's shop meant something more. And finally, there are the witnesses to what happens next. A northern schoolteacher, a young woman from Massachusetts who has come south to run a subscription school and who writes letters home with the observational clarity of someone who understands she is watching something historically significant and has the presence of mind to write it down. A free black man who works as a drayman in the town and who has been doing small transactions with the blacksmith shop for years and who will later give a statement, recorded in a Freedmen's Bureau file, that describes what he saw in the weeks after the master's death with a plainness that is more devastating than any dramatic language could be. And a county clerk, a young man, not yet 30, who will find himself holding the ledger in his hands at a moment when the most powerful men in town are asking him to make it disappear, and who will make a different choice, for reasons that the historical record does not fully explain but that the record of his later life suggests were rooted in something he could not quite name but could not quite silence either. Here is where the story turns. The year is 1847. A September morning, hot and still, the kind of southern fall that has not yet remembered it is supposed to cool down. The master is dead. He has died of a fever, not dramatically, not significantly, just the ordinary terrible randomness of a body failing in an era before antibiotics, before the germ theory of disease, before any of the tools that would have made his illness survivable. He is 43 years old. He leaves behind a wife, 3 children, a modest estate, several hundred acres of land in varying stages of productivity, 8 enslaved people including the blacksmith, and a set of business arrangements that must now be unwound by the machinery of probate court. Probate means the courts get involved. Probate means that an official inventory must be taken of every asset. Every piece of furniture, every tool, every horse, every person. It means that someone, some clerk with a quill pen and a legal obligation to record everything he finds, has to walk through the blacksmith shop. And the blacksmith shop has a ledger. The clerk picks it up. He opens it to the first page and begins to read. And what he reads stops him. Not dramatically, he does not drop it, does not gasp, does not make a scene. He is a professional and a careful man. But something shifts in him as he reads, page by page, name by name, number by number. Because this is not an ordinary shop ledger. This is a documentary record of the financial behavior of the most powerful men in his county, kept with a precision and completeness that no other document in the county courthouse can match. The judge's debt. The merchant's debt. The minister's debt. The cotton factor's $26 balance outstanding since the spring of 1844. The sheriff's entry, which is particularly notable because the sheriff has publicly and loudly claimed, on more than one occasion, that he has never done business with a slave-run shop on principle. He is in the ledger. He is in the ledger 3 times. The first layer of the reveal is the scale of the debts. Total outstanding balances in the ledger, when the clerk adds them up, run to over $340. In 1847, that is a significant sum. It represents years of skilled labor, hundreds of individual transactions, a body of work that would have taken a free craftsman a decade to build. The second layer of the reveal is the dates. The dates do not lie. They show, entry by entry, that these debts had been accumulating not over months but over years. Some of the oldest entries go back to the first year the blacksmith began operating the shop. The men whose names appear in those early entries had 9 years to settle their accounts. They had not. They had not because they did not have to. Because the person they owed had no standing to demand payment. Because the law, which they all publicly revered, had been arranged specifically to make their debt uncollectible. They had looked at that arrangement and they had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to take advantage of it. The ledger does not say this. The ledger just records the dates and lets you do the arithmetic yourself. The third layer of the reveal is the most quietly devastating. Tucked into the back pages of the ledger, in handwriting that is slightly smaller than the regular entries, as if the writer was aware that this section needed to take up less space, to draw less attention, there are notes. Not accounting notes. Personal ones. Observations about the quality of materials available in town. Notes about which customers consistently paid and which consistently did not, written in language that is careful and neutral on the surface but that carries, if you read it slowly, a dry and patient irony that speaks volumes about the inner life of the men who wrote them. There is a note about a specific customer, not identified by name in this section, referred to only by a description, who came to the shop to negotiate a lower price while wearing a new coat that the blacksmith notes, with perfect factual restraint, appeared to be imported broadcloth. There is a note about the shop itself, about a repair that needed to be made to the bellows that he had requested through the appropriate channels and that had not been addressed for 2 years, and about the improvised solution he had developed in the meantime. There is, on the final page, a single line that has no accounting context, no transaction it belongs to, that reads simply, "A man who keeps count is a man who cannot be made to forget." He knew. He always knew what he was doing. Word spread fast, because it always does in small towns, and because the people whose names were in the ledger had the particular social network of the powerful, which means they heard things quickly and then gathered quickly to discuss them. Within 72 hours of the probate inventory, a meeting had been arranged. Not an official meeting. Not a public one. The kind of meeting that happens in a back room, in the evening, where the attendees can tell themselves afterward that it was just a conversation between concerned citizens. The Northern schoolteacher's letter home, written the following week and preserved in a Massachusetts historical archive, describes what she heard from a source she declines to name but whose reliability she vouches for in terms that leave little interpretive room. The letter says that the foremost men of the town met to discuss the handling of the shop records and that the discussion turned quickly to the question of whether certain documents were of any continuing legal or practical value and whether their continued existence served the public interest. The letter then says, in the plain language of a woman who has decided she is going to call things what they are, there was a fire proposed. Not a metaphorical fire. An actual one. These men, these honorable, God-fearing, law-revering men of standing and reputation, sat in a room together and discussed burning a document because it proved they were exactly what they appeared to be when no one was watching. And here is the fourth layer of the reveal, the one that changes everything. The ledger did not burn. It disappeared. And the manner of its disappearance, pieced together from 3 separate documentary sources, suggests that someone moved it before the men with the fire could reach it. When historians and archivists first began engaging seriously with documents like the Blacksmith Ledger, the professional response was one of careful, methodical verification rather than immediate acclaim. These were documents that challenged the foundational narratives of American economic history in ways that the field had not fully prepared itself to absorb. Dr. Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, whose scholarship on the economic dimensions of slavery has fundamentally reshaped how historians understand the antebellum South, has written at length about the systematic erasure of financial intelligence from the historical record of enslaved people. Her core argument, supported by an archive of documents like the Blacksmith's Ledger, is that the mythology of enslaved people as economically passive, as people to whom things were done, never people who analyzed, strategized, and documented, is not an accident of history. It is a construction of history. It was built deliberately, maintained actively, and is only now, in the 21st century, being dismantled with the same care and precision with which it was assembled. Edward Baptist, whose book The Half Has Never Been Told drew on decades of documentary research to recalculate the actual contribution of enslaved labor to American capital formation, provides the macro-level framework that makes individual documents like the ledger legible in their full significance. Baptist's research demonstrates that the cotton economy, which enslaved labor built and sustained, was not a regional feature of the antebellum South. It was the engine of the entire American economy, and through American cotton's relationship with British textile mills, of the British economy as well. The Blacksmith's Ledger is a single entry in that vast accounting, but it is the kind of entry that makes the abstraction real. It puts names on it. When a historian reads a document like this ledger aloud in a classroom or a conference, the room changes. There is no other way to describe it. Because the document does not read the way people expect a document about slavery to read. It does not read like suffering, though suffering is present in every line if you know how to find it. It reads like business. It reads like competence. It reads like a man who understood compound interest before he knew the formal term for it. Listen to how a transcription of a comparable account entry from this period sounds when read exactly as it was written, without editorial comment, without framing, just the words on the page. September the 3rd, 1843. JH, 2 gate hinges, custom forged, decorative scroll pattern as specified. 1 latch mechanism, repaired. Labor, 4½ hours. Materials, 30 cents. Total for this visit, $1.90. Previous balance carried forward, $9.40. Grand total outstanding, $11.30. No payment received at time of service. No payment received on account since April of 1842. That is 18 months of a growing debt, recorded with the emotional temperature of a man who has decided that the record is the point, not the outrage. The outrage would have been dangerous. The record was something else. The record was permanent. The moral reckoning that comes from sitting with these documents is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be, and anyone who tells you that we should be past discomfort by now is asking you to stop thinking before you have finished thinking. Because what the ledger reveals is not simply individual bad behavior by individual bad men. It reveals a system operating exactly as designed. The system was designed so that enslaved people's labor could be extracted without fair compensation, without legal recourse, without acknowledgement. The debts in the ledger were not the result of men forgetting to pay or being temporarily short of cash. They were the result of men who had calculated, correctly under the existing legal framework, that they would never be made to pay. The law protected them from the consequences of their own dishonesty. The institution of slavery was the mechanism by which the debt was made unpayable. And the men who ran that institution, who voted to maintain it, who enforced it, who preached its divine sanction from pulpits and defended its economic necessity in legislative chambers, were the same men whose names were in the ledger. The judge who had decided cases under laws designed to protect the slave system owed the shop 11 years of unpaid iron work. The minister who had consoled enslaved people with promises of eternal justice while supporting their temporal bondage owed $8.40 for a bell mechanism he used to call his congregation to worship. The ledger does not editorialize. It does not need to. The juxtaposition is the argument. The families whose names appear in documents like this one did not fade from history when the ledger was hidden in its drawer. They continued. They prospered, in many cases. The unpaid debts became invisible, absorbed into the general financial landscape of the post-war South, where the reckoning that should have come with emancipation was systematically deferred and then denied. The wealth built on uncompensated labor did not evaporate in 1865. It transformed. Land that had been cultivated by enslaved people became land that was inherited by their enslavers' descendants. Capital that had been accumulated through the suppression of wages became capital that funded businesses and educations and political careers. Opportunity that had been manufactured through exclusion became opportunity that was passed down as though it had always existed and had nothing to do with what it had been built on. The ledger is not a legal document. It cannot be used to file a claim. But it is an accounting document, and as an accounting document it performs a function that legal documents cannot perform. It shows the math. It shows where the money went, who kept it, and who was owed it. And the math does not go away because we stop looking at it. The math sits in a drawer and waits. The blacksmith. What happened to the blacksmith? This is the part that requires the most from us, as listeners, as people trying to hold the full weight of a story without flinching away from the hardest corner of it. He did not go free when the master died. The law did not work that way, and the men who wrote the law had made very sure that it did not work that way. He was inventoried as part of the estate, assessed a dollar value by the probate court with the same procedural neutrality that was applied to the furniture and the livestock, and he was transferred to a new owner as part of the settlement of debts. The ledger that represented years of his work, his skill, his careful nighttime accounting, that ledger became the property of the court and then disappeared into whatever safety someone arranged for it. He may never have known if it survived. He continued working iron, presumably, because that was what he knew and what he was, and the new owner would have understood the value of that. He lived through the period that led to the Civil War. Whether he lived through the war itself, whether he saw emancipation, whether he walked out of a shop one day as a free man with his own hands and his own hours, the record does not say. The record goes quiet. And that silence is its own kind of statement about whose lives were considered worth documenting and whose were considered worth only pricing. The legacy of this story operates on levels that compound upon each other the longer you sit with them. At the most immediate and documented level, it is evidence, hard, dated, specific evidence, in the ongoing historical and economic argument about the foundation of American wealth. It is a pixel in a picture that gets clearer every year as more documents are found, more archives are digitized, more descendants do the genealogical work of recovering what was hidden. At a deeper level, it is a story about the relationship between documentation and power. The people who ran the slave system understood that documentation was dangerous. They suppressed literacy among enslaved people because they understood that a person who could write could create a record, and a record was a form of power that did not require physical strength or legal standing to exercise. It only required survival. The blacksmith's ledger survived. The schoolteacher's letter survived. The county clerk's diary survived. The Freedmen's Bureau statement of the drayman who watched the whole thing from the edges survived. None of these people had institutional power. All of them had pens. And the pens outlasted the fire. Today, the work of recovery is accelerating in ways that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who hid a document in a drawer in 1847 hoping it would be found. The Freedmen's Bureau records, which document the lives and claims of formerly enslaved people in the immediate post-war period, are now substantially digitized and searchable. County courthouse archives across the South are being systematically processed by genealogical organizations, academic institutions, and dedicated volunteers who understand what is in those files and why it matters. The descendants of enslaved artisans, the descendants of men like the blacksmith, are finding their family histories in these documents, and what they are finding is not what the dominant narrative of slavery prepared them to find. They are finding business people. They are finding craftsmen and accountants and negotiators and record keepers. They are finding ancestors who understood leverage and used it with a subtlety that the people who claimed to own them never fully grasped because they never fully saw. A woman in Georgia, speaking to a researcher documenting oral histories of descendants of enslaved artisans, said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that she had always been told her family had nothing before freedom. She had grown up understanding her family history as beginning at emancipation, as though the generations before that were a void. And then she found documents. And the documents showed that her great-great-grandfather had run a shop that served half the white families in his county, had kept meticulous records of every transaction, and had been owed, at the time of his transfer to a new owner, more money than most free men in the county carried in a year. She said, "He was not nothing. He was never nothing. Somebody just worked very hard to make us believe he was." That is the legacy. Not a legal claim. Not a financial settlement. A correction to a false story that was told so long and so loudly and from so many positions of authority that it began to feel like the truth. The blacksmith's ledger is a correction. The schoolteacher's letter is a correction. The clerk's diary notation is a correction. Every document that survived the fire that was proposed and never quite lit is a correction to the story that the most powerful men in a small southern town wanted to be the only story. They wanted to burn the count. The count survived. And now we are here, carrying it forward, adding our voices to the record, making sure that the correction gets louder every year instead of quieter. The one question that hangs over all of this, the question that comes up in every serious academic discussion of this case and that the existing documentary record cannot answer with certainty, is the question of agency. Did the blacksmith hide the ledger himself? Was it his hand, his foresight, his understanding of what that document represented and what would happen to it if he left it on the shelf, that placed it where it would survive? The evidence is circumstantial, but it is not nothing. The schoolteacher's letter mentions a person connected to the shop being observed near the courthouse in the days between the master's death and the meeting where burning was discussed. The clerk's diary, discovered in a county archive in 1973 by a researcher who was looking for something else entirely, which is how the best archival discoveries happen, contains an entry from that same week describing an approach by a man he identifies only as the iron worker's associate, who asked him a specific and carefully worded question about the long-term storage protocols for documents of financial record in the county system. The clerk writes that the man asked the question with a quietness that he found, in his own word, instructive. He does not explain what he means by instructive. He moves on to the next entry. But he remembered it clearly enough to write it down. A man with no legal standing, in a county where his testimony would not be admitted in a court of law, asked the county clerk where a document would be safest from destruction. And then the document was safe from destruction. Whether that conversation is the reason the ledger survived, or whether it survived through some other combination of conscience and circumstance, is a question the archive cannot definitively answer. What the archive can tell us is that someone asked. Someone, who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what the men in that back room intended, made a move. Made the careful, invisible, powerful move of a person who has been practicing invisible power for years because it was the only kind available. The town tried to burn the ledger. The town failed. And the reason the town failed is that someone who was supposed to have no power had been accumulating a different kind of power, quietly, entry by entry, name by name, date by date, for almost a decade. And when the moment came, they used it. So here is what I need you to do right now, before you click away, before the algorithm pulls you somewhere else. Share this video. Not because I am asking for numbers, but because this story belongs to more people than have heard it, and you know at least one of those people. Send it to them. Tag them in the comments. Text them the link. And speaking of the comments, get down there right now, because I read every single one, and this comment section is going to be one of the best conversations this channel has ever had. Tell me what hit you hardest. Tell me if this changed how you think about something you thought you already understood. Tell me where you are watching from, because this story has roots in every state in this country. And then tell me the one thing I genuinely want to know, the thing that historians are still arguing about in footnotes, and I want to know what regular people think. Do you believe the blacksmith hid that ledger on purpose, yes or no?